Thanks very much indeed, Philip. Much appreciated. And a very different area, but hugely relevant and important to what we're talking about here. So our panel for this discussion, and I'm going to invite them to take their places, is Dr. Tom van Rensburg, who's a senior lecturer in economics at the School of Business and Economics here in the University of Galway. We have Captain Brian FitzGerald from the Community Liaison Service for the National Designated Maritime Area Plan that we've just been hearing about in the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment. And we're very pleased to have Richard Bruton join us again for this panel, given his wide experience right across government. So as for the last panel, I'm going to go to each of you individually and ask for a short input from you, if I could. And I might start with Tom, if that's okay on this occasion. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, it's a very interesting talk. I think there's a number of points I'd like to make. The first is, I suppose, as an academic economist working here in Galway, is to talk about, in a sense, sort of aligning incentives. Because there is I think it's really critical to, when you're dealing with different stakeholders over something like, energy provision, which I've worked on a lot on over the last 10 years, you've got to understand the incentive structure. So for private sector developers that are building the plant, as the example that Philip showed, there has to be a good business model. But there is a whole other set of values that are important in terms of the environment, biodiversity, issues of social acceptability, and so on, that are really critical in this kind of infrastructure. And with this particular area, you're dependent on the private sector to roll out the energy infrastructure, and that has to pay. So a good business model is important, but you also have not only within onshore but also offshore wind, a whole variety of different uses of the environment, and understanding how to protect those is really critical. So we've heard about the plan-led model, but previous to that, it has been a developer-led model. So my first point is understanding those incentives. When you have a developer-led model, it's ultimately led by a narrow set of values which relate to good business, and it has to be profitable. But what you also need to do is to protect what we call in the jargon those non-market goods and services, those externalities, which are crucial, and to avoid big social costs. Historically, the problem with the developer-led model is there's no reason as an economist why developers would be concerned about those, because they're outside the market price, they're externalities. So interestingly, the new change to a plan-led model has started to accommodate those values. And you have to understand that incentive structure. So how do you do that? So my second point is, in order to craft a different set of legislation, in order to do that, that architecture, you've got to canvass what those interests are. You've got to talk to the NGOs. You've got to talk to civil society. You've got to talk to all the different groups that essentially are using those resources, as well as the business sector, and that will enable you through rule formation to craft the appropriate legislation, so that you capture those values. And in so doing, we heard from Mike Kenny the importance of building trust. When you solicit and canvass those interests, you begin to forge trust. One of the hallmarks of good governance is the legislation legitimate? And if you do that properly, my second point is the rules that you end up in building that architecture are going to be socially supported if you canvass those interest groups. So it's vitally important to communicate that. And what we heard from Philip was a really rigorous process in how you canvass that broad opinion. That hasn't happened over the last 20 years successfully in terms of meeting all the targets and best practice around procedural and distributional justice with onshore wind. It's been very patchy, largely because it's been driven by the public sector. So I think you're seeing a really important shift. One question is whether the learnings from something like the presentation that we've seen, some of those ideas can be transferred back to help meet these ambitious targets of having 80% of our electricity from onshore. You know, I think that's a topic for another debate. But that issue of Camille mentioned it earlier, of an inclusive process by which you communicate to all key stakeholders, absolutely crucial. And then the third issue is ensuring you don't have conflicting policies. So you've got to understand how any emergence of a new framework to be effective isn't conflicting with the existing legislation. The fourth thing is really crucial in terms of consistency. Policies, once they're enacted, they have to be consistent. I've seen so much sort of changes of 2 or 3 years and knee-jerk reactions around the whole issue of community renewable energy, where it's changed every couple of years, and that sends very mixed signals to the industry. So you've got to be able to do that. And lastly, as an academic, if you're looking for impact, one of the things we try and do in the research, and I think it's necessary to align the key policy questions in an area with the funding point of view. And if you can do that, SEI and the EPA have got much, much better in the last 5 years at targeting funding around key policy questions like this to enable academics to bid for those proposals and then begin to do that. One of the things we do, Mike Kenny talked about the needs of policymakers. So you've got to assess how what kind of barriers, what opportunities are for policymakers. And we always do this at the beginning of our projects. We look at we run workshops to assess the needs of policymakers on a sector, the needs of civil society, and the needs of the industry, and try and get an idea of what the key questions are. And then as we do, so that we do the research in a way that speaks to those questions, that we try and engage the policymakers as we travel through that journey to the end of the projects. And then at the end, hopefully we're creating research that answers to those problems because it has listened to some of the barriers. And then we try and make it accessible so that it has an impact. And we have lots of opportunities in the university to do that. I mean, we have plenty of multidisciplinary work where if we're looking at impact on a question like this, we can assess the changes in biodiversity, we can assess the changes in social acceptability, and we can use that and build that in, because policies are dynamic and they need to change. But I think the crucial piece here is public engagement. And in the past, we haven't done it particularly well in this sector. In the future, examples like what Philip demonstrated here, where you have that regulatory certainty for the policymakers and decision makers, but you also have it for industry, but you speak to the communities that are also impacted, and you build legitimacy and trust through that process. And it's a very nice example of good governance emerging in Ireland, and I really enjoyed your presentation. So those are my comments.
Thanks, Tom, and certainly the building of trust and empathy, which Philip had spoken about there as well, is obviously highly relevant. Brian, can I come to you next?
Yes, please, thank you. And I'm conscious of time. Obviously, I agree 100% with everything was just said. I thank Philip for his presentation. Just a small mental exercise. I'll give you something just to maybe a little takeaway. Just don't put your hand up. This is a metaphorical exercise in your mind. Hands up anybody here who is an islander. Now, if you didn't put your hand up and you were born in Ireland, you failed the test. This is very important. We are islanders. It is probably the single most important economic, social, cultural factor about our very existence. In fact, we live on an island that's off another island before you even get to the mainland. There is a different legal regime on the land than there is at sea. On the land, it's all based on proprietary rights. Who owns the thing? When you go to sea, it's all about freedom. Nobody owns it, and therefore everybody owns it. So it's a totally different legal environment when you put to sea. And offshore renewable energy is going to be located in that interface between land-sea interactions, two completely different legal regimes. Now, do you see what I've just done? I've just given you information. Information is power. I've just brought you over to say that actually this might be something worth listening to. You've got all the detail now from Philip at the policy end. My job is right out on the front line dealing with the community. So what I do, as I've done to you just now, is I don't go out to the public and go into the trench and expect that they're in another trench. I walk around behind them, I climb into their trench and I say, hi, I'm here from government, how can I help you? And I want to engage with you and I want to have empathy, and because I spent 40 years in the Navy, suddenly I'm in a space where I have a bit of credibility and so on and so forth. So what's it all about? As you very well described, it's all about achieving the social license to operate. Probably, and we already heard it this morning with the pension scheme, if society says no, the challenge is far, far greater. And I do accept the argument that you should not be surprised. You should have been able to work it out. Now, it happens at the highest level. Donald Trump has been completely surprised by the way the Iranians reacted. And that's just a simple fact. The Americans did not expect the Iranians to do what they did, and they should have known what they were going to do. So achieving a social license to operate is key. I think it is tremendously far-sighted. I think I can say this as somebody who's been in the public service for 40 years, for the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment to actually appoint people like a community liaison officer and a fisheries liaison officer to go out and be the public face of what is a wonderful policy presentation, as you saw there. But there is different language when you're out there. There's different engagements when you're out there. So I'll give you a practical example. And it was mentioned earlier that we've come in a much more disparate society now. It isn't like the older systems where there are large groups, we'll say, unions and so on and so forth can represent public opinion. Now it's completely disparate and a small group can take it. So therefore, go after the small group. Don't sit back and say, oh, they're just a small group. Go after them. So example, I'm sitting at home one day and I get an email in to say, this lady, her name was Catherine Gray, she won't mind me saying her name, she's a correspondent that writes for the newspaper. She published an article in a Waterford newspaper, and it basically, the entirety of the article was that she was down to a bench near looking out over the sea, and she met a bunch of old gentlemen, and they said that there's ships out there and they couldn't identify what the ship was for. They said that must be to do with the offshore renewable energy. She got talking to them, oh, they're going to be building wind turbines right on top of our face, right on top of here, they're going to destroy our coastline, they're going to destroy our lives, this is a disgrace. And she got all powered up with that and went away and wrote an article to say, and she said, if any of you know the metal man down in Tremor, she said, if they build an offshore wind farm down here, I will chain myself to the metal man. So I rang her and said to her, if they don't build an offshore wind farm down there, I'm going to chain myself to the metal man with you. Can I meet you for coffee? And let's discuss it. So I went down and I met her. And I explained the background. You see, Philip can't go out and explain that background to every single citizen, but somebody like I can. So I explained it to her. And by the end of the conversation, she was completely pro offshore renewable energy. So you don't leave it. You have to go after it. And you have to have the resources to go after it. So I'm just going to buy myself a job there. But you have to invest in that. And I think the DMAP is a very good example of that.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian. Richard?
You know, I think the rationalisation of all the permitting is really a very positive move, and I think we have the right framework. But a bit like Father Ted asking where's the catch, you know, I think my first question would be where could the wheels fall off this? Like, it is a two-stage process. One is the permitting piece, and the second is getting it to market and getting it, you know, successfully into our grid or into users. I think on the first, the permitting side, I'd have to recall the strategic housing legislation that was designed to streamline, you know, developments of over 100. It got totally embroiled in judicial review, and it eventually was abandoned. So I think we have to think about, you know, do we have mechanisms in this to resolve those trade-offs? Like John pointed out, that we thought we had put pensions to bed in 2011, and in 2020, when, you know, the rubber was hitting the road, suddenly there was this resistance. I suppose we have to really test that. Now, one of the difficulties I see, like, we haven't yet built a single piece of offshore, you know, other than the 25,000 or whatever it is. So we've none of this delivered, and we've an ambition of, you know, 5 + 2 in 2030. Like, you know, I think we have to be realistic. That's not going to be achieved. And I would not like to think that people will start to say this is a failure because we didn't get to the 5. So I think we need to, I think, do some serious testing of whether this model can deliver the consensus, and then whether the second piece of having the state infrastructure to bring it from where it lands into the grid and into utilisation, whether we've thought out that path. So my thing is, you know, who's going to be the driver of these other bits? Permitting is good, and I think we have a much better model of permitting now, but who's going to be the driver of to get this to actually deliver a renewable wind? Like, it's all having a perfect permitting system, but it runs into trouble. Like the housing strategy would be a problem. I think we also need to work on what you might call the compelling narrative for what we're trying to do here, why we want renewable energy, and I'm not sure that has 100% been the case. We seem to balk at the idea of generating renewable energy, but we don't have any ill feeling about having holes in the ground in the middle of every village storing inflammable petrol. So we need to socialise the sort of infrastructure that goes with our ambition to be zero carbon by 2050. I think we're living in a world now where that Green Deal is being pushed back, and I think we have to think about it and maybe present it in a different way. People are now worried about affordability, they're worried about resilience, and the worry about emissions seems to have gone down. I think we need to try and find a narrative that brings people back on board with the entire, the circular economy, which I know Philip was very familiar with. All these elements of our more sustainable future. We have to win that argument, and I think that's critical to the success of what you've put huge work into creating here.
Thanks, Richard. Philip, have you any thoughts
Sure.
on what you said there?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, a lot that I agree with. Just on the difference between this and the strategic housing developments is there's no new permitting process here. It's an emphasis on the forward planning stage to ensure that the existing permitting processes that apply to anything else are more predictable and can be delivered in a faster time frame. But there's no kind of new obligation on board and all that to do things faster. It's normal planning rules. It's normal MARA requirements as well. On that social license to operate, I think it is fundamental, and that means sometimes doing things that you're uncomfortable with. And just as Brian was speaking, it brought me back to when I was in Galway, I think in 2017 or 2018, at the start of the marine planning process, developing the National Marine Plan, and we had an event on, can't remember where in the city it was, we had a panel discussion, and the intention was that we would have people from different sectors talking about, in general terms, what they wanted to see the national plan do. And we had a protest outside, which I thought was brilliant, because we were so far below the radar in, nobody really was that interested in marine planning. Nobody really knew about it. So protest, this was great. I'm delighted to see this. So I went out and talked to them, and it was a couple of representatives from the Galway Bay Against Salmon Cages group, and they had a legitimate concern around the process itself, but also they felt that one of the representatives on the panel that day was from an aquaculture background, and they felt that we were kind of implicitly endorsing her views. So I said, we're absolutely not. We're just looking for multiple views. And what kind of really helped buy credibility with them straight away was we were having an event in Sligo the next week, and I said, why don't you come along, be on the panel, be great. And they were surprised to be asked, surprised to be given their platform and their opportunity to input. And again, small examples like that I think are really important. On that issue around the Green Deal, or what's been called the greying of the Green Deal, that's absolutely the case. And that means that we need to present, say, the climate message differently for a domestic audience and internationally, which is another part of my role. So the EU is very good at talking about, the importance of mitigation, the importance of, moving away from fossil fuels. That's landing quite hollow with countries who are much more focused on adaptation and for whom climate change is an existential crisis now rather than 50 years' time. So the EU needs to get much better at communicating the message of climate action and talking about economic opportunities and better health outcomes and access to clean cooking for women and girls, etc., etc. So things that are real rather than emissions reductions for emissions reduction's sake. The same is true domestically. We need to be talking to people about the society of the future. What does electrification, what does an electrified Ireland look like in 2050? How does it improve lives? How do we move around our country? How does it change the way we eat? How does it change the way we work, etc., etc.? And that positive message, rather than it being something about the imposition of cost and taking things away, this should be about giving people things, giving people opportunities that kind of aren't there at the moment. I know that sounds quite idealistic, but really that's we need to be quite hard-edged about communicating that idealistic message, because I think the international circumstances are converging to make the energy transition not just a thing about emissions reduction, but it's about affordability and it's about security. We've seen since the current conflict in the Middle East just how important energy security is. So if anything, the last 4 or 5 months have given greater impetus to the energy transition, albeit for different reasons. It's about energy security, energy affordability.
And interestingly, despite the obvious progress that you've made, I think I was picking up a good deal of frustration at the slowness of some of the processes. Is there anything we can learn from your sector in terms of being able to speed up those processes in any way, in terms of more effective, speedier implementation?
So I've worked in terrestrial planning and in marine planning previously, so I'm a bit nerdy when it comes to this. And in our interactions on accelerating infrastructure, what we were arguing for, and to be fair, this argument was kind of largely accepted by the tender, was don't just focus on the bit at the end. Put the time into the forward plan stage. Again, strengthening the decision-making framework for regulators, make things more predictable. And in the case of the DMAP process, like there were howls of protest from the renewable energy industry when we said, okay, we're not doing the developer-led approach anymore. We're going to pause things basically for 2 to 3 years until we have a plan in place. So having the courage, I think, to say, and I'm not saying that I had the courage because I wasn't an elected representative who had to, take the downside of it. It was Eamon Ryan who did. But having the courage to say, actually, no, we're going to pause and we're going to put the time in now to accelerate things in the longer term, I think, is the key. And Richard's right as well that not everything has been resolved here, and there will still be flashpoints. There will still be challenges to individual projects, but I think we'll be dealing with those in a much better framework in terms of trust and credibility.
So we're still talking about long-term versus short-term, and the long-term policy that's going to take some time, Richard, to bear fruit. Is there anything further that we can do in that regard in the short term that will help us make progress in that regard?
To me?
Yeah, sorry, Richard.
Sorry.
You were nodding your head.
Well, I think that's the critical thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I think as John said, biting with the president's teeth is a very effective way of speeding up the outcome. Like we had the action plan for jobs, and the Taoiseach took it deadly seriously. Targets were set, timelines were set, they were expected to be met, people were held to account for not meeting them. So I think you have to have a system that drives this. Like I think Philip has designed something that has the capacity to work like clockwork, but someone else has the capacity to throw sand into it, and we have to find ways of making sure it delivers. So I would think, and it goes back to something Mike said, a new relationship between government and politicians and the public service is needed. In some of these key strategic areas, we need to have political drive for their delivery. But we shouldn't pretend that the programme for government, which is often put together in the most whimsical way, is the be-all and end-all for the next 5 years. There has to be flexibility for engagement at a national level to adapt and amend. And now, renewable energy has become absolutely crucial. It was described as a moonshot for us, but now it is so crucial. So I think the key is getting the political focus onto it and keeping that relentlessly there.
Thanks very much indeed, Richard. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, and as for the previous session, we could have had the entire day on it. Could I thank Richard, Tom, Brian and Philip?